it was a beautiful spot, and had a beautiful, nice green lawn, and I used to get out there and you know, throw balls around and do that sort of thing. And then, of course, going up to the farm, going back behind the house, going up to the barn. I did that as a youngster. Calves, helping to feed the calves. And then something you always did with your city friends, because a calf has an instinct, of course, to nurse, to suck. And we were feeding the calves out of buckets, putting a certain amount of milk in a small bucket. Well, the calf would suck that bucket dry and still not have satisfied its sucking urge. And we could stick our fingers out and the calf would just come right up on your hand, just start sucking your hand. And we made sure our city friends got to experience that, because it really, it created different emotions. Of course, one of our friends lost a ring that way, but that's, yeah.
So your dad was in the dairy business at this point?
Yes. Rosny, like so many farms, was a general farm initially, and that is, we grew corn, small grains, ran some beef cattle, milked a few cows, had an orchard, sold fruit. You know, anything you could sell to get money into the farm was done. But slowly but surely, a number of farmers, and my father among them, began to focus on dairy farming, because in the post-Depression era, milk brought in pretty good money, and it brought it in regularly. You got a milk check every month, and that made it a lot easier to run a farm operation.
And you started even working on the farm as a young boy, right?
Oh heavens, yes. Of course, one of your earliest jobs would be to be the water boy out in the field. And we were still working a huge gang of people. And yeah, one or two water boys was not unusual. I did that, thinned corn.
I heard that's hard work.
That is hard work. Chopping thistles, which didn't, I mean, I think they grew back as we chopped them. But those were all boys' work. Always a lot of work for boys on a farm. And the only problem was supervision. The ancient rule of thumb that one boy is a boy, two boys is half a boy, three boys is no boy at all.
Do you remember World War II?
I do. I don't remember the first part of World War II. Geographically, I didn't really have a good grasp. I knew what Italy looked like. That was interesting. But every single morning, my father would turn on the radio, and we would get about 15 minutes of Gabriel Hita. I don't know if anybody living today, other than me and maybe some 80 and 90-year-olds, know about Gabriel Hita. But he was a phenomenal newscaster. He was sort of the Douglas Southall Freeman of this area. And I remember one particular morning in June, I was going up the lane to the dairy barn, and there were a group of men doing a particular job, and I stopped for a moment and I told them, we invaded France this morning. And that, of course, was a fair amount of news, and that was D-Day.
You considered Orange to be your hometown?
Oh yes, where we were located on the farm, Orange was vastly more accessible than Madison, and actually offered more of what we needed in the way of supplies and services. And so we were Orange oriented even from my home in Madison.
Yeah. And just as an aside, I mean, what was the town kind of like then? What memories do you have of the town back when you were a child? And
as a child, it was an extraordinarily busy, extraordinarily interesting town. Of course, I didn't really begin to focus until the Second World War was underway, 39, 40, thereabouts. And at that time, Orange had 3 hardware stores, 2 sizable hotels, at least 6, maybe 8 churches, whole bunch of factories, both in and out of town. I think it was 5 farm equipment dealerships. It was just, Orange was just really busy. And of course you look around today, it's a different Orange, there's no question about it.
not as busy today?
Oh heavens, all the hardware stores are gone. Farm equipment dealerships have changed, and not nearly as many. A whole lot is not going on. I mean, several of the factory buildings that were just humming during the Second World War are closed.
Now, school in those early days, what was involved there?
My schooling was somewhat different. Now we had small private schools being run locally. I went to Miss Holliday's school in the town of Orange for a time, but also because I had rheumatic fever that took me totally out of circulation. I was in bed for months. I actually experienced the Calvert school system. You know, I guess you'd call it a mail order school. You send them a certain amount of money, and they send you the books and the paper and the pencils and the erasers and the teaching guide for the teacher. And basically, it was a prefabricated homeschool, and I did that. That turned out to be extremely interesting. I really liked that.
So, at what age were you when you got the rheumatic fever?
I was probably around 7. I went to University of Virginia Hospital, and Dr. McLemore Birdsong, and he took 2 of us with rheumatic fever and treated us with massive doses of aspirin, and it worked. I know for years after that, and I would be in a doctor's office and then want to know what my prior illnesses, episodes were, and I'd say I had rheumatic fever. That ultimately, immediately, they would immediately start listening for a heart murmur, bad valve, something, heart damage, and there wasn't any, and never has been any.
Well, because I was told that your heart swelled up to the size of a football.
That's correct. That's what they tell me. They were looking at me through I forget the name of the machine, and they could map it, and it was huge.
And no permanent damage?
Absolutely none whatsoever.
Do you think maybe that the massive doses of aspirin thinned your blood to the point that it didn't overwork your heart?
Must have been. One of the things I did sitting in bed, I had mortar and a pestle, and I would pour aspirin in there and grind it up into a powder, which is what I would be taking in a while. I basically sort of created my own medication.
You went to Woodberry,
Right.
of course, and and you started going there at age 14?
Well, let me back up and pick up on your comment. I went to Woodberry, of course. Of course is right. My father was the president of the Woodberry Corporation at that time.
And your grandfather, of course, was the founder of the school.
My grandfather was the founder, and three of my uncles were operating in, part of the active management. Uncle Carter, Uncle Joe, and Uncle John were all active in the operations and management of the school. My father had been the farm manager, and he took over Rosny, and I went to Woodberry for 6 years and graduated in 1953. So I guess I was 12 or 13. I guess I was probably 13. I was very young, not only totally inexperienced with that type of school system, I was totally out of sync socially. I never knew people like my classmates at Woodberry existed until they were my classmates at Woodberry.
Now, you were a day boy?
My first year was, and that was an academic disaster. And so the arrangements were that I would be a boarding student, and I repeated my first year again. But it took me, Woodberry, they call the years forms, and I guess I really didn't get the swing of being a student until about my 5th form year at Woodberry. But there's no question that Woodberry, in that process, taught me absolutely the most important thing that I could ever learn anywhere, and that is how to teach myself. And I learned that. And that's a skill I use every day.
So you graduated from Woodberry in 1953, and did you immediately go to Virginia Tech?
Oh yes, and that was almost, of course, also. My father was at Virginia Tech, and at this point, my father was basically grooming me to take over the farm and run it, and he pretty much had me walking in his tracks. As I got older, as I got more mature, I realized I was going to have to create my own tracks. The way he farmed was not going to be the way farming was going to be. It took me a while to learn that. But I guess one of the first things, first indications my father got that might be so, my father went to Virginia Tech, if I remember correctly, for 2 years. And that's what he wanted me to do, because that's what he had done. And I told him no, I was going to go for 4 years. And I did go for 4 years. He didn't really make an issue of it. And that was very worthwhile.
And so you graduated from Tech with a degree in agronomy, is that correct?
Agronomy, yes. And agronomy is a study of both plants and soils and how the two interrelate.
So it was not livestock oriented, your degree, your field of study?
No, unfortunately, and I guess I can say this from this vantage, this distance, but the dairy department, dairy science department at Virginia Tech was pronounced by my father to be extraordinarily poor. And so my father's instructions from me were to take courses in agronomy and take extra courses over in the dairy science department, which I did. Found it interesting. I had to agree with him that the dairy science department at Tech at that time was not good. I was in ROTC, but again, I'm supposed to be back on the farm as soon as I can. I refused to accept a commission. I stayed in the Corps Cadets, but not as an ROTC student, and I joined the United States Army Reserve. Of course, Korea was going on. Didn't know exactly when or what something might happen, and it wouldn't hurt to have sort of a connection with the Army, and indeed it worked out beautifully. The Army offered, I guess it was during my senior year at Tech, 56, 57, the Army offered a branch request program, which meant that if you agreed to go into the Army and do all of the necessary training for a 6-month period, followed by 5.5 years of reserve, they would allow you to pick your branch of service. But 6 months active duty meant that I got back to the farm, and that's exactly what I did.
Now, at some point during that active duty, you were a military policeman.
That was my branch. I requested military police.
Did you ever crack any heads with a billy club?
No, mainly, well, there were two things that I remember out of military police training particularly. One is crowd and riot control. But the other thing, which is more general, is that while I was a military policeman, I was what they called a combat MP. That is, I was a military policeman who jumped with the parachutists, who came off the landing craft with the infantry, that sort of thing. As I describe it to some people, being a combat MP means that you stand in the middle of an intersection directing traffic while everybody else is hiding in the ditches with bullets zinging around.
Were you ever deployed overseas?
No, that was one of the drawbacks. Of course, I'd love to have gone overseas, but it was probably just as well considering my eyesight situation. But at the time that I was in on active duty is when the British, and I think it was the French, who went in together and opened up the Suez Canal that Egypt had closed down and was demanding certain things of other countries. And the British, and I'm pretty sure the French joined them, military went in and essentially seized the Suez Canal and reopened it. And our military police battalion, we packed our packs, and we weren't issued ammunition. It was close. The trucks were waiting outside, and we were sleeping in uniform, ready to head to the airport. My roommate and I, with him, went to a party where Bernie showed up. And she was still is, a very striking lady. But I remember that she had on a black skirt, may have been a whole black, I think it was just a black skirt, and had a red petticoat under it, and that was just flashy. No escapes, escapades, all that sort of stuff. No, not really. I lived I guess I denied myself a lot. I don't know. But the main thing, and Lord knows this is true, The only thing I really know how to do extremely well is work. And that's what I do. Yeah, fishing is one thing I did. But that was not an escapade. Fishing and hunting. Oh yeah. Yeah, fishing and hunting. My mother would drop me off on the Rapidan River about, I guess, 4.5, anywhere from 4 to 4.5, 5 miles upstream, and I would wade all the way down, swimming through the deep spots, and I'd have a fly rod with a spinner. That's about all I'd need. And man, I'd catch everything. I'd catch bass, I'd catch brim, I'd catch crappie, even catch an occasional carp would come up and strike that spinner. I just was catching anything I'd bite.
You went to the Darden School of Business at some point.
Right. And yeah, I graduated from there in '60. No, you see, I graduated from Virginia Tech in '57 and went into, I guess I went into the Army, I may have gone into the Army in '58 or '59, I can't remember. But I was finishing up at the Army, finishing up Darden, getting married, and taking over the farm all in 1960.
And then from 1960 to 1978, you were a dairyman.
That's correct. I was active, of course, in the Virginia JCs through that period of time. I didn't, and in the church.
St. Thomas?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Planning Commission.
And then the Planning Commission.
Yeah, I was on the Madison County Planning Commission, I guess, for about 13 years.
And helped write their comprehensive plan.
Yeah, that was fascinating. In fact, what little business law I had taken at Virginia Tech, and my encountering the legal system doing the comprehensive plan interested me in law.
You mentioned earlier that you were following in your father's footsteps. Were you doing so willingly, or were you kicking and screaming the whole time?
I didn't know any better. As time went on, I learned better. But I also, by that time, loved farming. I really loved the life. I loved the challenges, how you meet them or how you figure out how to avoid them and work around them. And I really loved farming. But I realized as time, I realized more and more and more intensely that I could not farm the way he had farmed. It wasn't going to work. And I think probably the best example I can give of the difference is that when I took over the farm to run it myself, there were between 30 and 33 employed people doing what were necessary things, and horribly underpaid. The farm was not going to survive very long if we continued to run it in the way that he understood. I mean, he was using, there were some vestiges of the old plantation system, gang labor. My father was used to gang labor and minimal mechanization. In fact, Chip said there was a contest on in Madison County as to whether Billy Ewers or Frank Walker would be the last person to buy a tractor. The farm wasn't producing that much income. And that was 1960. And the last year that we actually milked cows, had a dairy operation, was 1978. And we now were producing milk at a volume probably 3 times the volume that we were producing in 1960. Crop yields, everything, the quality of the animals that we were breeding and producing. I had one of the top 10, I think maybe it was the top one of, I think I may have had the fifth best herd in the state. And we had 3 state record holders in the herd. And I was doing that with 6 men. And that was one too many. And I ran numbers. I tell people that's when my business degree paid off. I ran any kind of way I could run the numbers. And all it told me was there was no future dairy farming in this part of Virginia. It may be future somewhere else, but it wasn't here.
Right.
Not in this market. And of course, by this time, as I say, the herd was going extraordinarily well. The breeding program, the nutrition, everything was going. I mean, it was the business of, if this is as good as it's going to get, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
Talk about meeting challenges. I learned plumbing. I didn't do any real sophisticated plumbing, but I did plumbing. I did electrical wiring, and some of that got pretty, particularly when we built our new milking parlor, some of that got pretty sophisticated. Welding. In fact, I've got a set of swings out here that I created, welded, while I was at the farm. But I built at least sort of basic farm machines. I actually just built them right there at the farm shop. And the last skill that I learned was artificial insemination. I started breeding, doing the breeding of the cattle with liquid nitrogen, and your bull came in little straws. That was your bull.
Have you had any close calls, accidents, near misses?
Oh, good Lord, yes. Of course, agriculture, you have construction, mining, and agriculture are usually the top three people killing occupations. Mining is usually number 1, but then construction and agriculture sort of depends on the economy. And the thing is, the constant between those 3 is that your working environment keeps changing on you. The mine is different, the rock is different over your head in one place as to another. In construction, something that was not slick and slippery yesterday is today. And in agriculture, it rains, and all of a sudden something that was very easy and simple can be dangerous.
Did you ever pass out in a silo or become overwhelmed in a silo?
No. You're talking about that bromine gas, silo gas.
Yeah.
Man, I had no idea how dangerous that stuff was. I probably as a teenager, because what it would do, and I used to, I worked in the silos a lot. And, you know, as the silage rose up, you put up doors and kept filling. And at the end of the day, all of that begins to settle. And when you're about 3/4 of the way up in a silo, it might settle as much as 4 feet overnight. And this dark red, reddish brown gas would collect in the low spots. And shoot, I can remember you'd go up there, and where you had the silage right up to the door, it's now down about 3 or 4 feet. Well, you don't want to knock that door out. You did enough work getting it in. So I'd get up over top of it, and I would jump down into that gas. But it was never deep enough. Now I had, and I can remember seeing that stuff coming down a silo chute. It was heavier than air, and you'd see it come down out of the silo chute, and the wind would blow it away. And when it was that way, we would start up the filling equipment and just blow air for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then you could go up there and it was fine.
Now, other than the rheumatic fever, did you have any bad illnesses or hospitalizations?
Yeah, I caught flu. And I can't remember what year it was, but I passed out. I was so sick, I passed out. And they took me to the hospital in an ambulance. It was, I guess, in the early 70s. Jet planes were coming right over this ridge where this house is, right here. And they were coming over the top of this ridge, they tell me. We weren't living up here at the time. Coming over the top of this ridge so close, they were making the tops of the trees wave. And then that was not low enough. They'd get right over this ridge and then drop down and start flying across the river bottom and headed directly towards my farm. And the dairy operation with the silos and the grain bins and everything is up on a little knoll, high spot, but just to one side of it, just to the east of it, it's a low swale with a stream going through it, a fairly wide, low swale. And one of the things I used to love to do was to top out the silos. It would usually be 2 or maybe 3 of us up there, and you were so far up into the very top of the silo that the filling equipment no longer worked, and you had to go in and fork the silage out to the edge and then walk around the edge of the silo and pack it down, and you were actually above the top of the silo. And I was in the 80-foot silo one day doing this. I heard a sound and I looked over, and there was this jet plane going up through that little swale, and I looked down into the cockpit. The guy had a red helmet on. Chuck Tainer, who lived up here on this ridge at the time, got a wing number. How he could, those things went over so fast, I have no idea, but he got enough of a wing number, called one of his friends in Washington. They told him the planes came from Oceana Naval Air Station, which is just down the coast from Virginia Beach. And so Chuck called down there, and they gave him the director of flight operations. And so Chuck starts giving this guy up and down the river about these planes coming over, scaring the cattle and everything else. And Chuck says, why? And then the director of flight operations starts giving him the mantra about, we have to teach our pilots about flying under the radar. It's very important for national defense. So yeah, I know that. Said, why don't you train them somewhere out in the boondocks? And the director said, yes, sir. Where do you live, by the way? So Chuck tells him. Said, one moment, the phone went down. Paper shuffling around. Phone picks back up, says, Mr. Tainer, you are in the boondocks. So that he didn't win on that point, but the planes started coming in a little higher. We sold Rosny in 1979. We sold the dairy herd in 78.
In 1978, you were at the tender age of 43 years old. You decided you're going to become a lawyer.
Right. Yeah. Remember, I had learned how to teach myself. And so I started preparing. I started reading, started studying. I was still horribly unprepared, but at least I was not unfamiliarized. And the thing that worked in my favor was that the University of Virginia Law School was beginning to look into these second career people who wanted to, they'd worked a career at one thing and they now wanted to get into law. And I think I was the first one that they took. Maybe because they couldn't really, maybe they just wanted to take a look at somebody who'd milk cows, I don't know. Of course, as I told my friends, some of my friends in the dairy business, Well, they started saying I was going to go from milking livestock to milking the public. I told them I'd see them in court. But here I am, as you say, 43. And I'm the absolute oldest student in the law school at the University of Virginia. They call me the Dean of the Gray Panthers. My last year in law school, just 3 short years later, the oldest student in the law school was 80. Because until I passed the bar, it was not clear that I had, in fact, stepped out of my father's world and the farm and had stepped into a new world. And in my last year of law school, it began to dawn on me, if I can't pass the bar exam, I'm stuck in that world. And so that was a real watershed. That was the equivalent of 1960. A real watershed. And I actually took the bar exam during my 3rd year of law school. They allowed you to do that back then. And I think some of the faculty of the law school were astounded that I passed the bar exam. I could not, absolutely could not have done it without not only Bernice's help, physical help, but the fact that she supported me in doing this. Because, you know, some of this is a little outlandish. I mean, I stayed up in Charlottesville during the week, going to law school for 3 years. And that's when Bernice went and got a job at Grimes School, taught for 17 years at Grimes School.
We need to, at this point, move to the part where all of a sudden you got bitten by the history bug.
That's really, you know, that was interesting because my father, he almost had to, considering the amount of heritage in the family, he almost had to refuse to discuss it. I mean, maybe it really didn't interest him. I don't know. But we never discussed history growing up. I never discussed history with my father or mother. And so I knew almost nothing about what was around me. Now, we had a cannonball and a 3-inch shell in the house. The shell, in fact, was used as a doorstop. And they had been plowed up on the farm. Several cannonballs had been plowed up. But my curiosity was at that point not sufficiently ignited to where, you know, I asked, how could they have possibly gotten there? You know, what went on? I really knew nothing about the American Civil War until after. Well, I guess I'd read a book on Stonewall Jackson, which I didn't really altogether understand. But I really didn't begin to focus on local and regional history until after Bernice and I were married and we were farming. Didn't have a lot of time for that, but began to become curious about things went on around here. What were they? Why? And then when I got into the practice law, I had more time. I had weekends. I no longer had to milk cows on Saturday and Sunday and that sort of thing. And that's when it really took off. And it's just fascinating, everything that has gone on around here. Just really fascinating. One of the reasons so much of the physical evidence of the history of this county exists today is that through almost all of the entire 20th century in Orange County, absolutely nothing happened. There was Lake of the Woods, development down there. Other than that, things didn't change. And while that made it tough for folks who were living through that, it meant that we were able to get in and preserve a lot of the physical evidences of our history before development got here. I was starting to put together tours. I decided that somebody needed to preach the gospel of Orange County history. And by this time my focus was on Orange County. I was no longer living in Madison County. And Orange County has a whole lot more of a wider variety of history. And I focused on that, and I started writing up these sketches and these outlines. I had a whole bunch of outlines as time went on, and then when Joe Rowe was president of the Orange County Historical Society, he issued a call for someone to step forward and write a new history of Orange County. That the one we were using was quite old, W.W. Scott, and all due respect to Mr. Scott, but he hated Baptists and despised Indians, and if he didn't like you, you didn't get this book, history though it might be. And here I am with all of these outlines, and I say to myself, and I guess to others, I've got the basics of a book here. I basically have the outline of a book. And so I said I'd do it. And I essentially took my tour outlines and filled them in, organized them, filled them in, related them, and turned it into a book.
How did you find all the information?
It's everywhere. A phenomenal resource, of course, is the Orange County Historical Society archives. Basically, I got it all out of books.
Yeah.
Again, remember, I had learned how to teach myself.
Right, and then how did you learn to remember so much?
He has a memory that just won't
I think because of my eye problem. I really need to have it stored up here because, you know, reading it is not, reading keeps getting worse and worse. It's called retinitis pigmentosa, and it's a genetic inherited condition, and it can come at you and express itself in a lot of different ways because it comes from a number of different gene locations, and the particular kind that's in our family starts out as the normal RP, and that is the outside of your eye's retina starts to die, and it dies from the outside in until it's died right down to the central visual nerve. And because it was in the family, my sisters used to say they already knew I had RP when I was 10 years old. So it was very, very, very gradual, which if you've got to have something like that, it's a blessing because it gives you time to adjust, time to adapt. It's moved very, very, very slowly. But it's gotten to be crippling now.
Mm. And I remember talking to you when I did an article about you, oh gosh, it was 15 years ago. You talked about your father had the same condition, and he would get on his horse at Woodberry Forest and riding Rob Roy on the buckle.
Yep.
And when he stopped, he knew he was home.
Right. Yep. He would get Rob Roy out of the stable at Woodberry, tighten up the girth, get on Rob Roy and start him, and then put the reins down on the saddle and let Rob Roy take him home. There's, at the time, down on the river bottom, there was a small farm owned by a man named Shula. He had a little bit of a problem with alcohol. And the road that my father took at that time, you went from Woodberry all the way down to Barnett's Ford, in other words, on the Rapidan Madison Mills. And then you picked up Medley's Road, and Medley's Road carried you by the entrance to Rosny. And I don't know how old my father was at this time, but he said in the summertime, sometimes old man Shula would be out there on the porch. It was after dark. And my father would be riding along, and all of a sudden this voice would come out of the dark, you know, "Walker!" Father said he wouldn't say a word. "Right, Walker!" Not a word. "Right, Walker, I know that's you, 'cause that's the sound of your horse." My father kept going clip, clop, clip, clop. Finally, Shula couldn't take it any longer. "Walker, why don't you marry one of my daughters?" And then he'd fire a shotgun up through the trees. Boom!
Well, Frank, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I have, I think, distilled down what I believe is the reasons we should pay attention to the American Civil War. And it goes like this: that Tom Brokaw preached to the choir and we bought it, that America's greatest generation was what he called the America's greatest generation. I now realize that America's greatest generation were those men and women and children who crawled out of that crucible of the American Civil War and went about finishing the development, the creation of America. Because America at that time was very definitely an unfinished product. And they, black, white, young, old, they worked. They may not have always enjoyed working with each other or who was in charge, what they were doing, but they worked. And they finished the creation of America, establishing it as the most powerful country in the world with a set of positive values. The three most important values, I think, are a religious faith, patriotism, and conservatism, and they carried that into the 20th century, and we demonstrated it to the world briefly in World War I, and then we showed the world everything that we were and what we stood for in World War II. And it all got its origins from the American Civil War. And we need to study those people and find out what made them tick, because they were America's greatest generation.
And then I always ask the people that I talk to, what advice would you give the younger generation today?
Read. Read. Read good stuff. Don't read fluff. Don't read trash. Read real information. And read for understanding, not for amusement, but read for understanding. And the best way I can define understanding is the way one of my employees used to say, when we would be discussing something, working on a problem, but how we were going to resolve it. And we'd talk and talk, and then he would say, now I understand what I know. It's one thing to know, it's another thing to understand it.